Chapter 67. Pong. The sword thrown by the Death Knight pierced into the wall of the hallway and shattered the wall into rubble. Although Eugene had managed to avoid the throw, he couldn't afford to relax. The Death Knight was still attacking him. Fuck, this stinks. Although it wasn't hot down here, Eugene had been moving his body so vigorously that his whole body was now drenched in sweat. It had been a long time since he had last felt this tired, and it wasn't just his overworked muscles either. The mana in his core was slowly starting to bottom out. Eugene had overused his strength to keep up the reckless parrying and break through the Death Knight's defenses. If it wasn't for his ring flame formula, his mana would have already been depleted and he would have collapsed onto the floor. Now what do I do? Eugene had managed to see the Death Knight's face. He had confirmed that its body was created from Hamel's corpse. He had also confirmed that the soul inserted into that body was just the soul of some unknown bastard. But that wasn't enough. Eugene wanted to kill this Death Knight and was determined to do so now. Adjusting his breathing, Eugene continued to operate the ring flame formula. The source of power for a human being was their heart. But a Death Knight's heart didn't beat, nor did it have any flowing blood. To kill a Death Knight, one would need to tear it into so many pieces such that it wouldn't be able to regenerate any longer. Was the current Eugene able to do such a thing? Even if he couldn't, Eugene would just have to manage it somehow. So why ask such an obvious question? Eugene encouraged himself like this as wind wrapped around his blade. As the amount of mana Eugene could infuse into the blade dwindled, the wind evoked by his spirit was strengthened to make up for it. Bonk. Eugene's body flew into the air. Swallowing the blood that he was about to cough up, Eugene looked down at the floor. The Death Knight rose slowly from the center of a deep crater that looked like the site of a recent explosion. All it had done was throw away its sword, but it was now incomparably faster and stronger than it had been before. This was its original level of skill. By holding a sword that it wasn't even familiar with, and as it had tried to prioritize using common sword techniques without leaning on its true strength, all of the Death Knight's moves had been blunt and simple. But now... Fuck. Each time Eugene endured an attack, it felt like his arms were being torn out of their sockets. Even though he was parrying the blows with each burst of mana, he could feel his reserves of mana being drained away in large clumps. It was a godsend that Eugene was able to handle releasing such large bursts of mana. It was fortunate that Eugene had trained his control over his mana by using the Moonlight Sword's fragment as the target of his spells, because if he hadn't done that, his mana would already have reached the bottom of the tank through his parrying alone. But my specs still fall short, Eugene noted pessimistically. When the Death Knight was still holding a sword, it had been an easy opponent, but now that it had dropped the sword and was fighting with its bare hands, it was a tough opponent for him. On top of that, the Death Knight's fighting style was so messy that it was difficult for him to read the attacks and gauge how much mana he needed to deal with them. It was like he was fighting with a wild beast or a monster. It might be fighting with its bare hands, but although the Death Knight was wearing gauntlets, it wasn't fighting with its fists. Black demonic power was wrapped around its hands, and it was swinging its fingertips like they were claws. Claws? Oh, it's different. Its fingers are curved, which means it's also using the power of its hands. Some weapons had blades on the back of their hands or even their fingertips. Those sorts of weapons focused on slicing and scratching. However, the Death Knight's style was different. It was actively using its grip strength and its knuckles. It wasn't just using its arms like a beast's limbs. Then there was also its posture. The Death Knight was tilting its upper body forward, and its arms were nearly low enough to touch the floor. It seemed that this posture was a more natural fit for it than when it had been standing upright on both feet, as it was correspondingly more agile. Fuck. If they were going to put a soul in my body, then it should at least have been a human soul. Just what kind of monster did they stuff in there? A monster? No, was it really? It had been able to hold a conversation, but then there was its messy and barbaric fighting style. Its primary weapons were its arms and fingertips. Though its stance looked sloppy, the center of gravity was clearly settled around its lower body. There was also the way it had gone into a berserk frenzy. He had seen something like this somewhere before. A lycanthrope? The moment he uttered these words, the Death Knight's fingertips scraped against WNYD. Eugene twisted so that his body turned with the blow's force rather than resisting it. By doing this, he managed to retreat backward after spinning around a few times. Graw. The Death Knight let out a bestial howl. Its teeth were grinding and gnashing against each other. A glance downward showed that the Death Knight was wearing metal boots, but even there black demonic power was sticking out like claws. Fuck, I was right, Eugene cursed suddenly. What kind of combination is this? Why would they stuff a lycanthrope's soul into a human's corpse? What on earth do we even call something like you? There was no answer to his questions, Brewer. It looked like his words weren't getting through to it. Eugene spat out the blood pooling in his mouth and glared at the Death Knight. They really are pulling all sorts of crap. Barking out these words, Eugene reached into his cloak once more. Visit. For the best no_undershirt experience. Growling. The Death Knight charged over with another growl. Since the situation had changed from what it had been earlier, the tools that Eugene was using should also change to keep him from being passive. Eugene pulled out a small box and crushed it in his grip. This revealed the fragment of the Moonlight Sword, which he took and threw at the fingertips, slashing at him. A single fragment won't be enough to dissipate everything. However, it could at least reduce the power of the blow to an acceptable level. WNYD's slash drove into the Death Knight's wavering demonic power. Clackling. The power of Eugene's blow was also dissipated by the fragment. Things might have been different had he been using the real Moonlight Sword, but the fragment sure was inconvenient to use. That said, it was enough to turn the tides. As Eugene swung his sword in a frenzy, he pushed back the Death Knight's claws. This way he was able to snatch up the shard and throw it at the Death Knight once more. He repeated this over and over until his head felt like it was about to explode. Eugene had to read the dizzying trajectory of the Death Knight's attacks. Avoid what could be avoided, then grab the fragment, throw it, attack, and then grab the fragment once more. And the cycle repeated. Although Eugene was familiar with all sorts of fights, even in his previous life he had never once been in a fight as troublesome as this one. Eugene was getting short of breath. He had no choice but to accept that the difference in their specs was far too large. Even though they should both have been consuming each other's strengths, the Death Knight's demonic power appeared barely drained. Instead, every time it was attacked, the Death Knight was becoming even more ferocious. Eugene was wearing the Cloak of Darkness. It was an artifact that could block spells up to the 5th circle without any difficulty, but it still wasn't enough to completely protect Eugene's body from the Death Knight's attacks. Shallow wounds kept piling up and Eugene's body was drenched in blood. He had already lost enough blood that his sight was starting to get blurry. However, his concentration kept getting sharper even as the mana in his core was slowly starting to reach rock bottom. Should he try to retreat now? His specs just weren't high enough to win this fight. If it were a few years later, Eugene felt like he would be able to win this. But should he retreat because of that? Someone like him? In the face of someone who was playing around with his corpse? Eugene had managed to pierce through the Death Knight's defenses several times. But its armor was just too tough. He had tried to thrust his blade into the joints, but he didn't get the feeling that he was cutting anything important. It seemed that the corpse itself had also been strengthened. And Death Knights were the highest rank of undead, so it was impossible for Eugene to neutralize it with just that one fragment of the Moonlight Sword. Ever so slowly, Eugene started getting pushed back. While he was still putting up a fight by actively using the fragment, Eugene's body wasn't mature enough to draw out Hamel's full power. His physical abilities were sufficient for it, but his mana capacity still wasn't enough. Garg. Eugene gasped as he swallowed back the blood that was about to escape his lips and threw his body back into the fight. Slash. The Death Knight's fingertips scraped past, slicing open his side, but Eugene ignored this as well. By doing this, he was able to thrust the fragment of the Moonlight Sword into the Death Knight's chest. The Death Knight's flickering demonic power lashed out at Eugene's arms and body, but Eugene just pushed his head even closer and pressed strongly on the fragment. Just as the Death Knight's defenses were dimming, Eugene started casting spells. Explosions and projectiles burst against the Death Knight's undefended breastplate. A fragment of the Moonlight Sword was able to dissipate all magical power into neutral mana. Eugene was very familiar with this effect, so he knew it was fine as long as his spells didn't touch it directly. With bloodshot eyes, he made sure to control the trajectories of each of his spells. A chain of explosions landed around the fragment. With a rage-filled roar, the Death Knight's body was thrown backward. Eugene wasn't able to catch the falling fragment in his hands. He didn't have any strength left to spare for that. He coughed up blood as he kept his eyes fixed on the dark cloud of smoke. Eugene had only managed to push it back for a few moments. The Death Knight wasn't defeated yet. However, he had succeeded in shattering the breastplate it had been wearing. Cuckoo. Eugene chuckled as he saw something absurd. He wasn't laughing at how tough the Death Knight was. He was laughing because the shattered breastplate had exposed its chest. There was nothing there. Only a hollow hole could be seen in the Death Knight's torso. The wound that had caused Hamel to die in his previous life had remained intact even hundreds of years later. And in the center of that hole he could see there was a red gem placed within. It seemed obvious that it was meant to serve as this thing's heart. No, don't look, demanded the insane Death Knight that had mistaken itself for Hamel. Eugene snickered and pointed at the hole in its chest. He asked mockingly, "You're saying that you're Hamel with that thing in your chest?" The Death Knight roared in anger, "Grah. It was important to know when you could afford to provoke someone and when you would be better off staying silent. Now was the time to do the latter." Although Eugene knew this very well, he just couldn't stand it. Having seen it for himself, how could he not laugh at the absurdity? But the price for his momentary amusement was harsh. Bonk. Eugene's body was slammed against the wall. Although the cloak of darkness gave him some protection, since he was driven into the wall with enough force to crumble it, his body didn't make it out unharmed. His bones were definitely injured and it felt like his internal organs might be as well. "Stupid bastard. How could you be Hamel? You're just a Death Knight. Not even a human one at that. But a lycanthrope." Eugene collapsed onto the floor and coughed out blood as he smiled. "From the way you move, it looks like you were some kind of feline beast." "Huh. Could you have been a tiger? Or maybe a lion?" "No, that's not it. Seeing how your actions are so cute, you might just be a house cat." The Death Knight growled, "I'll kill you." "Just try it, you fucking bastard. What were you trying to say again when you can't even deal with a 19-year-old kid? You said that you were Hamel? Are you making fun of Hamel?" Eugene mocked the Death Knight as he tried to get to his feet. Crunch. The Death Knight didn't allow Eugene to stand up. It grabbed Eugene by the shoulders and pulled him up so they could talk face to face. I am Hamel," the Death Knight insisted. "Like fuck you are, asshole," Eugene cursed as he spat some of the blood flowing from his mouth into the Death Knight's face. "Also, don't get so close to me. Since you give off the smell of a rotting corpse. If you've died once, then you should just rest in peace already. Where do you think you get off, wandering around in someone else's corpse and messing with the living?" Grr. Crunch. The hands holding Eugene's shoulders tightened their grip. Suppressing a groan, Eugene glared into the Death Knight's face. Eugene had lost. Was he going to die now? Just like this? No, this wasn't the end for him. He had even been reincarnated, so he had no intention of dying in such a fruitless manner. If he had felt like he was going to lose, he would have run away immediately. Eugene hadn't run away because he had wanted to confirm its identity. When Eugene had first raised his sword against the Death Knight, he had felt like he could win. No. If I really have to use that, I'll be a fucking mess for the next few years. Although it wasn't all that impressive in his previous life as Hamel, he had kept one special move hidden as his trump card. In fact, it was so simple that it couldn't even really be called a special move. But still, if Eugene used it, he was sure to win. He would win no matter what. Even a special psychopath like this Death Knight that wouldn't die unless it was torn to pieces would be shattered into dust without leaving any traces behind. But as strong as this move was, it came with the same amount of recoil. Although it was impossible for him to kill a Death Knight with his current specs, if he used ignition, Eugene would definitely be able to kill it. Just as Eugene was considering whether or not to use it, he heard a voice call out to him. "Young master." "What now?" It was Lehman Schulhoff. That fool, Eugene had knocked him out to give him the chance to run away, but why had he continued to follow Eugene all the way here? Eugene couldn't turn his head to look at Lehman. The Death Knight was still holding Eugene by his shoulders. "Get back, you monster," Lehman shouted as he rushed at the Death Knight. But the Death Knight also didn't turn to look at Lehman. It just picked Eugene up with one hand and threw him at the ceiling on the opposite side of the room to Lehman. Gag. Bang boom. Eugene's thrown body crashed into the ceiling, slammed back down to the floor and was sent rolling across the room. Since Eugene had been reincarnated, this was the first time that his body had been so severely damaged. As Eugene kept spitting blood, he raised his head. Perhaps could it be? For a few moments Eugene got his hopes up. Was it possible that Lehman, who had come running here so confidently, had awakened some great power and was now able to defeat the Death Knight? But this ended up being just a daydream. Layman's sword force was easily overpowered by the Death Knight, and his kukri was shattered to pieces. You. Then Layman wasn't even able to get away in time. The Death Knight grabbed Layman by the throat and turned to look at Eugene. Surprisingly, it asked, "Is this your henchman?" "Nope," Eugene casually denied. Layman shouted, "Young master. Please run away. While I've got a hold of him." What kind of bullshit was that when Layman was the one who was being held captive? Eugene burst out laughing because his claim was so ridiculous. This just made Layman admire Eugene even more. Even after suffering so many injuries and being cornered in a fight with this mysterious monster, Eugene was still able to laugh like that. He truly is a great man, Layman wholeheartedly admired. While Layman was caught up in his arbitrary fantasies about Eugene, the Death Knight glared at the still grinning Eugene and threw Layman at him. Visit. For the best no_undershirt experience. Gah! Layman screamed. Eugene was struck by the thrown Layman and was sent skidding across the ground with him. What? Growling. Is so funny, the Death Knight growled. I'm just laughing since you look like a fool, Eugene said as he pushed Layman off him and staggered to his feet. Layman got up at the same time as Eugene and quickly moved to support him. Young master. I'll rush over and make an opening so you have to run away no matter what. You don't need to try and save me anymore. Layman gave this heartfelt plea, but neither the Death Knight nor Eugene paid him any attention. You're saying that I'm funny? Yeah. You're hilarious. Behind Eugene stood a tightly closed door. It was the door that the Death Knight had been guarding at the start. Even though it knew there was a door here, the Death Knight had still thrown Eugene over to this side instead of where they had first entered. This meant that it didn't matter even if they did open it. Or else that it wasn't able to be opened. Let's confirm this first. Eugene shuffled his feet backward. Layman, who was supporting Eugene, was also dragged back. Seeing this sight, the corners of the Death Knight's mouth twisted into a smile. That's not where you should try to escape to, it informed them with a growl. Even though there's a door here as well? Eugene asked casually. Are you afraid of me? No, as I said, I find you amusing. Then why are you trying to open that door? I'm curious to see what's inside there. That door doesn't open. Nobody, not even her, has been able to open that door. Is that so? Eugene's hand reached the door. Layman was looking between Eugene and the Death Knight with an anxious expression. Why had they gotten close to a door that couldn't even be opened? Could it be that this was some part of a deliberate plan to distract the enemy? As expected of a great man like him. Just as it looked like Eugene was trying to open the door, they should charge at the enemy. Of course, Layman couldn't just say something like this out loud. Instead, Layman furiously winked one eye at Eugene to inform Eugene that he was in on the plan. Why the hell is he winking like that? Eugene thought to himself. I've already told you it's useless, the Death Knight said. That door doesn't open. After hearing those words, I want to open it up even more, Eugene cheekily replied. If this was a situation where he would need to use ignition, then Eugene would have no choice but to use it. However, before that he still had to check what was behind this door. Since this was Hamel's tomb and he was Hamel, then if Sienna or someone else had planned for his reincarnation, then this door that wouldn't open no matter what must have been left for this grave's owner. Though perhaps Amelia Merwin opened it and then immediately spelled it shut. As Eugene considered this thought, he pushed against the door. But it didn't open, his attempt had failed. Immediately after this, Eugene's necklace gave off a small light. Eugene felt some heat coming from his necklace as the door began to move. Eugene smirked. See, it does open. The Death Knight's expression changed. It quickly kicked off the ground and charged at Eugene, but Eugene pushed the door open and dragged Layman in with him. No, rather than opening the door, it was more like they were sucked through the door. Ugh! Layman collapsed onto the ground with a groan. Unable to understand what had just happened, he raised his head to look around, but Eugene chopped him on the back of the neck to keep him from getting up. Although you weren't of any help since you did try to save me, as Eugene muttered this, he took a seat on the back of the now unconscious Layman. Eugene turned his head around to look behind him. The door was shut tight. The Death Knight must be going crazy trying to open the door, but the door didn't even shake, let alone transmit the sound of someone pounding on the other side. For now, Eugene could assume that this was a safe place. He nodded his head and turned his head to the front. Those crazy bastards, Eugene muttered as he looked at the center of the wide-open space in front of him. Why did they leave it here? The light that illuminated this dark room wasn't coming from a magically conjured flame. It was the pale shade of moonlight. In the center of the dark room, a crescent moon hovered over a pure white coffin. Chapter 68. 300 years ago in Helmuth, near the Demon King of Carnage's castle. It had originally been a plain, but the entire area had been overturned due to the battle with the Demon King of Carnage. After the battle was over, the heroes searched the surroundings to see if there were any remaining forces that had fled the Demon King's castle or were trying to stay hidden in the vicinity. Somewhere in all that overturned ground they found a path leading underground. Under the suspicion that they might fight Carnage's minions hiding down there, they followed the path downwards, but they didn't find any demon folk, demonic beasts or monsters down there. It was unknown for how long it had been around, but they found a ruin deep underground. Upon seeing the ancient words carved into the walls, Sienna speculated that it might be a relic of the mythological period. Sienna and Anise were able to translate most ancient scripts, but even for erudites like them, it was impossible to translate the ancient language that they found engraved on the walls of the ruin. Eventually, since they weren't able to uncover the true identity of these ruins, they had no choice but to explore deeper into the ruins. And in the deepest level of these ruins they found a hidden room. There was no opening to the outside and no source of light, yet in the center of the room they saw a full moon shining with a pale light. I call dibs on that one. As soon as he saw the sword that had been embedded beneath the moon, Hamel immediately took the lead in claiming it. His companions didn't have any complaints. In their battle with the Demon King of Carnage, most of Hamel's weapons had been shattered and broken, leaving him with only a single intact sword. As for the Annihilation Hammer Jigalath, the weapon wielded by the Demon King of Carnage, both Hamel and Molin had coveted it, but neither of them were able to become the Annihilation Hammer's new master. It was close to impossible for a human to properly wield a Demon King's weapon, so the only one who could wield it without taking any damage was Vermouth. Molin preferred heavy and large axes over swords. Vermouth already possessed various weapons such as Wed, the Holy Sword and Geddon's Shield. Moreover, he had just gotten his hands on the Annihilation Hammer as well. Thus he didn't put up a fight when Hamel claimed the sword that they found in these ruins. However, Hamel wasn't able to get his hand on the sword. The moment that he got close to the sword bathed in moonlight, he fell to his knees coughing out blood. The mysterious moonlight also dissipated Hamel's mana and left him feeling disorientated. In the end, that sword was also taken by Vermouth. Vermouth was the only one in the party who could safely approach it from beneath the moonlight and draw the sword. No one knew the reasons for this. But in fact, this wasn't anything to be surprised about. All his comrades knew just how special Vermouth was. Motherfucker, why do you always end up with everything? I tried to yield it to you. And who asked you to do that? Would you like me to hand it to you now? I won't take it, you crazy fool. Are you trying to piss me off? They gave the sword that they had found in the ruins the name of the Moonlight Sword. Although the name was simple and straightforward, it was also appropriate. The sword had been found embedded in the ground beneath a full moon. The gray blade that could be seen whenever it was pulled out of its scabbard appeared to be the same shade as moonlight, and whenever the sword was swung, the luminous phenomenon it produced looked like it was scattering rays of moonlight. Yet despite its appearance, that thing wasn't just a simple sword. It wasn't just Hamel who had felt that way, all of his companions shared this sentiment. Fundamentally, literally any weapon was a tool meant to kill and destroy. However, among all the weapons in the world, the Moonlight Sword most perfectly captured the essence of this entity called weapon. The Moonlight Sword was pure ruination in the shape of a sword. The Demon Spear Luentos was the prided weapon of the Demon King of Cruelty, and its terror was overwhelming. In spite of that, it couldn't even pierce through the light of the Moonlight Sword. After Vermouth got his hands on the Moonlight Sword, the Holy Sword would no longer make an appearance on the battlefield. This was only natural. Rather than the beautiful Holy Sword that emitted a brilliant light, the simple-looking Moonlight Sword was much, much stronger. Currently, Eugene was blankly staring up at a moon. In the ruins where they had first discovered the sword, the moon they had seen had been a full one. However, the one in front of him now was only a crescent moon. As Eugene was about to pull out his fragment of the Moonlight Sword, he burst into laughter. I forgot to pick that thing up. After slamming into the Death Knight's chest, the fragment had fallen to the floor, and Eugene hadn't gotten a chance to pick it up. He had wanted to take the fragment out to see if it would show any reaction, but it looked like he would have to leave that for later. Vermouth, Eugene muttered as he shook his head from side to side. Why did you leave something like this in my grave? Unlike when he had first seen it 300 years ago, the moonlight sword wasn't embedded into the ground, but was instead floating in the air. Eugene stared at the moonlight sword as it hovered in front of him. The fragment of the moonlight sword had been discovered in the Khazad Hills. As such, Eugene had thought that Vermouth had personally shattered the sword and sealed it away because it was too dangerous. But now what was the moonlight sword doing here? What reason could there be to seal the moonlight sword away in Hamel's grave of all places? Was it out of sympathy for me? Although Hamel had wanted to possess the moonlight sword, he hadn't been able to obtain it. He had never held any regrets because of this, but Eugene felt that this was a very Vermouth-like display of sympathy. Rather than writing a tear-filled letter or bursting out with some emotional words, Vermouth had been the kind of guy to just suddenly offer what his colleagues had desired, just like this. Eugene looked at the space below the moonlight sword. He could see a white coffin laying there. That was probably where his corpse had been placed. What's the use of giving it to me after I've died? Yugni laughed and shook his head as he said this, though he wouldn't have even been able to use it while he was alive. But this wasn't the time to get all emotional. Apart from the moonlight sword, there was nothing else in this room. It didn't have any statues or memorial stones like the room outside. The only entrance was the door that they had used to enter. That was also the only way out. If they wanted to leave this room, they would have no choice but to face that damned insane Death Knight once more. The Death Knight wasn't the only thing that Eugene needed to be concerned about. The Black Wizard, Amelia Merwin, had also set foot in this grave. For a Death Knight to have been found here, it must have been Amelia Merwin who had created it. And Eugene had no idea when that bitch of a Black Wizard might return. As such, he needed to finish things here as soon as possible and then escape from here. The issue was that things were getting more complicated than he had expected. With a frown on his face, Eugene approached the moonlight sword. His body was still covered in wounds, and his heart was still racing from the battle's adrenaline. He didn't know why the moonlight sword was here or what Vermouth's intentions were for leaving the moonlight sword here, but the fact that it was here meant that Vermouth had left this sword as an offering to Hamel. If that's the case, that just means it's all right for me to take it. Saying this with a grin, Eugene stretched his hand out towards the moonlight. Yet feelings of worry outweighed Eugene's giddiness and hope. In his previous life as Hamel, it had been impossible for him to even hold the moonlight sword in his hand. Although he had been reincarnated as a descendant of Vermouth, would he really be able to wield the moonlight sword because of that? I'll just have to try and hold it, Eugene muttered as he reached his hand out. After all, that bastard did dedicate this sword to me. The moment his hand touched the moonlight, all the hairs on his body stood up in shock. Even though it should just be rays of light, Eugene's breath was starting to race. The mana inside his body was fluctuating and it felt like he would soon run out of mana just by leaving his hand under there. Eugene gritted his teeth and started operating the white flame formula in order to wrench back control over his mana. With this, Eugene pushed his body forward. Yet it was easier to handle than he'd been expecting. Was he recalling the experience incorrectly? Or was this because he was Vermouth's descendant? Could it be due to the fact he had learnt the same white flame formula as Vermouth? No. It's been weakened. Eugene was sure of this. The moonlight sword in front of him was incomparably weaker than the one that he had first seen in those ruins. Just as he had thought, the moonlight sword must definitely have been broken into pieces. His hand touched the hilt. Crackle. A gray electric current wrapped around Eugene's body. The mana that he had been keeping a tight grip on fluctuated wildly, but then calmly subsided. Taking a deep breath, Eugene sat down right where he was. He was holding it. The sword that Hamel hadn't been able to even touch. Eugene was now definitely able to hold it in his hands. Eugene calmed his rough breathing and glanced down at the moonlight sword. From the outside it just looked like an ordinary sword. Setting aside the overly glamorous holy sword, even Wmuidi had some fancy decorations on its pommel and guard, but the moonlight sword didn't have any of that. The same went for its scabbard as well. It didn't have any artwork or jewels. But such decorations weren't of any importance to a sword. Eugene took a gulp and grabbed the scabbard. It's not there. Although he'd been half expecting this as he pulled on the hilt with a shaking heart, the gray blade was nowhere to be seen. The moonlight sword had appeared to be intact from a distance, but in fact, only the ricasso was left of the whole blade, allowing the hilt and guard to be attached to the scabbard. As I thought, they must have shattered it. The moment this thought passed through his head, the crescent moon floating in the air began to dissipate. The moonlight that had been illuminating his surroundings gathered to the moonlight sword. Eugene watched what was happening to the moonlight sword with wide eyes. As the light converged, it took the shape of a straight blade. "Ha!" Eugene burst into laughter as he looked down at the gleaming sword. This blade was made of light, not metal, so it was different from the moonlight sword that Eugene was familiar with. Nevertheless, this light was still unmistakably moonlight. Eugene slowly raised the sword, infusing his mana into it at the same time. Visit for the best no_underscore experience. Although the moonlight sword could collapse all forms of magic and mana, Eugene's mana wasn't dissipated. Instead, the sword greedily swallowed up the mana, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Whoosh! The moonlight flickered like the flame of a candle. This was caused by the flames from the white flame formula resonating with the moonlight sword and becoming one. Eugene shrugged and smiled. It really is a bullshit sword. The words he spat didn't show any signs that he was overwhelmed with happiness. Eugene understood exactly what kind of weapon the moonlight sword had become. He knew that this sword made from light would be able to resonate with the white flame formula, but it proved to also be a huge drain on Eugene's mana. Of course, it might have a lot of power that made up for this drawback, but it was still a difficult weapon to handle for Eugene, who had yet to become complete. Still, it's amazing, Eugene complimented it. Even though it had been shattered into pieces, it still had this much strength. It might eat up his mana like crazy, but as long as he used it properly, it would be able to show overwhelming superiority during battles that used mana. If I had known that this would happen, I would have chosen the Devouring Sword. In the treasure vault of the Lionheart clan was stored the Devouring Sword Asphul, one of the weapons that Vermouth had used. The sword was able to slice apart spells and devour the mana. However, while its ability to slice apart spells was indeed similar to the Moonlight Sword, in terms of sheer power the latter was far superior. If the two swords were used together, their drawbacks would be compensated by each other. The mana drained by the Moonlight Sword would be supplemented by Asphul's absorption, and Asphul's lack of power would be supplemented by the Moonlight Sword. Since there's no way I could have known that I would actually be able to get my hands on the Moonlight Sword, it can't be helped. In any case, he already had WMD, which was unsurpassed in terms of convenience. If he was eventually able to successfully summon Tempest, Eugene would be able to create a storm even without having to swing his sword. If I do my best to act cute and beg for it, maybe they'll give me Asphul as well? Eugene muttered to himself. If it was Gilead, then this idea could probably work for real. Clicking his tongue, Eugene slid the Moonlight Sword back into its scabbard. Of course, it was just an idle thought. There was no way that Eugene would ever act cute in front of Gilead. But now what? Eugene fell into deep thought as he rubbed his chin. Should he just rest here and drag out the time for a bit? Oh, never mind. It would be a pain in the ass if Amelia were to arrive while he was doing that. I might still have the personal letter from Balzac, but there was no way that Eugene could have expected that he might encounter her in a place other than Amelia's own territory. Eugene might have accepted the letter, but he really didn't want to rely on Balzac's favor. Well, in the worst-case scenario, he would have no choice but to use it. Though I'm not sure if she truly will back down just by seeing one letter. Eugene couldn't put all his hopes into this letter. If at all possible, he wanted to handle this situation himself. He glanced at Layman, who was still collapsed on the ground. For now, he would just leave this guy here while he dealt with the Death Knight outside. As for Ignition, there's no need to use it, Eugene judged. This was also a chance to test the power of the Moonlight Sword. Before that, Eugene opened up the white coffin. As he had thought, there wasn't any corpse lying within. However, taking a closer look, Eugene was struck dumb with surprise. The corpse was indeed missing, but there were other things inside the coffin. On the underside of the coffin's lid, an inscription had been written. "Someday I will meet you again in the world that you've been longing for." And beneath these words written by Sienna, something else had fallen. Grr. While growling like a beast, the Death Knight glared at the door. Not much time had passed since the intruders had gone through that door. In this short time, the Death Knight had already swung its claws at the door hundreds of times. However, it still hadn't been able to break down the door. It had attempted to break through the door hundreds of times before, but let alone breaking, the door had never even shown any signs of damage. How did they enter? The Death Knight questioned once more. He just couldn't understand this. The Death Knight grabbed its head and groaned. This was the grave of the stupid Hamel. The Death Knight was stupid Hamel. That's just how it had to be. Since this body belonged to Hamel, the soul inside this body also had to be Hamel's. This was the strong suggestion that had been placed on the Death Knight when it was created. The master of the Death Knight had been able to synchronize the lycanthrope's soul with Hamel's body through this powerful suggestion. It was a necessary modification. Hamel's soul may not have remained inside it, but the corpse still carried all the traces of his life experiences. If the newly inserted replacement soul was able to perfectly tap into these traces and respond accordingly, then the Death Knight would be able to subconsciously draw from Hamel's experiences. The skills that were elicited through such a method might not be comparable to that of the real Hamel, but the Death Knight's master was still greatly interested in this prospect. Wasn't that only natural? The stupid Hamel was a companion of the Great Vermouth, and he was the only one among all these companions, Vermouth included, who had left an intact corpse. This corpse was one of the best materials for making a Death Knight. It was different from a soul, which was basically a consumable item. I am Hamel, the Death Knight mumbled as it tore at its hair. The lycanthrope knew that there had been several souls placed within this body before it, but it didn't know which version of Hamel it was. It didn't want to know either. If it became aware of this, its already unstable sense of self would only grow even more shaky. Disposal. The Death Knight's eyes shook and eyelids fluttered at this thought. Its helmet had been split open and its breastplate was shattered. The Death Knight's master had not permitted these to be broken, so they would definitely be enraged. And if that happened, the only thing waiting for it was disposal. Souls that were judged to be useless were discarded, and then other souls would be used as a component for the Death Knight instead. If the Death Knight wanted to avoid that, then it needed to prove that it wasn't useless junk that should be discarded. He needed to kill the intruders and offer them. Oh, it couldn't kill them. It needed to capture them. Since they were able to easily open the door that its master had been unsuccessfully trying to open, the Death Knight needed to offer them to its master alive. Need to do it quickly, before the master returns. Had its earnest wish been answered? The door started shaking. The Death Knight shook its body and readied its claws. This was also something that its master would be furious about. The master had insisted that it was a human, not the soul of a lycanthrope. This meant that it wasn't allowed to use its fingernails or toenails as claws, which meant that the Death Knight was forced to rely solely on the body's muscle memory for any fights. Readying its claws was a direct disobedience of its master's orders. However, the Death Knight couldn't help it. After all, this opponent wasn't green enough for the Death Knight to believe that it could defeat him by relying on unfamiliar methods. A call came as the door opened. "Did I keep you waiting?" Eugene had been expecting to be attacked the moment that the door opened. But the Death Knight didn't do that. Instead, it crouched down, lowering its center of mass and pressing its heels into the ground as if it was ready to explode into movement at any moment. It glared at Eugene. "How did you get through that door?" it questioned him. Eugene shrugged. "I just tried to go in." "What did you see inside there?" "It's a secret." "Who the hell are you?" Crunch. The Death Knight's feet dug into the ground. Eugene chuckled and placed his hand on the sword at his waist. He taunted the Death Knight. "Who do you think I am?" Greyaf. Having been persistently taunted like this, the Death Knight finally couldn't take it anymore, so he roared and kicked off the ground. It wanted to kill Eugene and tear him into pieces, but it couldn't afford to do that. Suppressing its murderous intent, the Death Knight swung its claws at Eugene. Eugene lowered his stance. Just as the Death Knight's claws drew close, he pulled out the Moonlight Sword. Chapter 69. The quick draw technique was, in simple terms, a technique for drawing the blade from its scabbard and slashing with it in one continuous motion. It was meant to catch the opponent off guard, and, if done well, it could also be used to cut things at extremely close range directly. The problem was that it usually wasn't all that powerful. No matter how fast the sword was pulled from its scabbard, it was much better to just get into the right stance and slash with the full force of your arms. But that was only as far as an ordinary sword was concerned. The Moonlight Sword didn't really have a physical blade at all. The entire length of the blade, except for a small bit of the ricasso, was made up of pure moonlight. Normally, this quick-draw technique required particular attention and care. When slashing out right after drawing, the blade could take damage from hitting the opponent at the wrong angle, so the speed of the draw was somewhat limited. But with the Moonlight Sword there was no need to care about that. All one had to do was draw and slash, no pause in between. Thanks to that, it was possible to raise the speed of the initial cut to its limits. And as for power? That was a silly question. The Moonlight Sword was ruination in the form of a sword. It was as if Eugene had just drawn a crescent moon, or at least that was what it looked like to his eyes. The moment that he drew the sword from its scabbard, the light of the sword seemed to become a new moon. Its light illuminated the darkness. No, it didn't just illuminate it. It broke the darkness apart. Crash. The Death Knight's claws that were approaching Eugene were shattered by the moonlight and completely erased from existence. The Death Knight's eyes showed that it didn't understand what had just happened. Huff. While taking a deep breath, Eugene pushed forward. Although he had only swung the sword once, it already felt like he was choking for air and his vision was blurred. These were the typical symptoms of mana depletion. Once Eugene's tank of mana completely reached the bottom, he would become exhausted and would have no choice but to collapse. I can do it twice more before I... Eugene had thought that he would have enough control over the sword's power, but as expected, the assumptions that he had made before actually trying to use it were quite off. Still, the power of this slash satisfied him. Even though he had only swung the sword once, he had completely crushed the incoming attack. The Death Knight could not comprehend what had happened. It had definitely swiped its claws. There was no way that this tired and weary intruder should have been able to respond. It had been intending to cut off the intruder's arms and bring him to his knees. Nonetheless, it had failed. The claws that had been slashing at its prey had been shattered by a pale light, and the Death Knight's gauntlets were now also cracking into pieces. Eugene clicked his tongue as he saw this. Fifi. I was trying to cut off your arm. Eugene's plan had been the same as the Death Knight's, and the results were also identical. Neither of the two ended up achieving their goal. The Death Knight had been unable to cut off Eugene's arms, and Eugene had also been unable to slice off the Death Knight's arm. Did I overestimate the power output? Or could it be that I was expecting too much from it and its strength actually dropped more than I thought since it's been shattered? Since he didn't have enough mana, Eugene hadn't been able to try its strength out earlier. What was clear was that, with its current power, the Moonlight Sword couldn't completely destroy the Death Knight's body. I've also cut the Death Knight a few times previously, but I wasn't able to really injure it. What the hell had they done to someone's corpse? As Eugene angrily ground his teeth, he approached the Death Knight. Grah, the Death Knight roared. It might not be able to understand what had happened, but the cause of the mystery was clear. That ominous light had shattered its demonic power. Demonic power was the source of all black magic. A high-ranking undead like a Death Knight wouldn't just disappear because it had used up all its demonic power, but consuming all of its power source to deal with an opponent like this would only further inflame its master's rage. Well, anyway, so what if that was the case? Wasn't the solution simple? There was no pressing need for the Death Knight to use its demonic power. Looking at the intruder, his eyes were cloudy and his face was pale. It didn't seem like he even had the strength needed to walk as he was now staggering over. With this body of its, although it had never properly learned swordsmanship, the Death Knight ever so rarely got the feeling that it was used to swinging a sword. However, it had never been able to draw these instincts out completely. Having fought with its claws, one for all its life, it was much easier and more efficient for the Death Knight to continue using its claws rather than wielding a sword. What it was going to do now was something that the Death Knight had always enjoyed and been good at. Although it didn't have its true claws, the Death Knight's enhanced grip power could shred a sheet of tough metal like it was just paper. And if its target was a human body, there was nothing stopping its hands from piercing into a human body and tearing it apart. Even with his blurry vision, Eugene was able to make out all of the Death Knight's movements. Was it really not going to use demonic power because it was wary of the Moonlight Sword? So what, it was just going to fight with its bare body? Without holding any weapons? Against him? I really don't think that's a good idea, Eugene commented as he saw the Death Knight getting ready to attack him with just its bare flesh. You cheeky bastard. As Eugene chuckled, he swapped the Moonlight Sword to his left hand. Then he drew WNYD with his right. Just maintaining the light of the Moonlight Sword was eating up all his mana, so Eugene couldn't afford to drag this out for too long. though Vermouth, that bastard, was able to wield it like it was just an ordinary sword. That monstrous son of a bitch. But Eugene had more pressing things to do than reminisce of the past. Right now, a literal monster was attacking him. Bam. The swinging hands were just as wild as ever. But perhaps because it wasn't using demonic power, Eugene's opponent didn't feel as overbearing as it had before. Eugene brushed its hand aside with WD and dove into its chest. As the moonlight sword was raised slightly, the Death Knight flinched and leapt backwards. I didn't even swing, Eugene scoffed. He cut at the retreating Death Knight's waist with WD. The sound of metal scraping against metal rang out. Although Eugene had only managed to make a shallow cut, that was enough. The wind that burst off of WE wrapped around the Death Knight's body. The latest understudies are on underfiv.website. It was the wind spirit gale. The Death Knight's entire body was engulfed in a whirlwind. While maintaining the light of the moonlight sword, Eugene calculated the Death Knight's coordinates. As his blue flames were infused into the whirlwind, they wrapped around the Death Knight's limbs. Gag! The Death Knight roared as it tried to free its limbs. It wasn't using demonic power, just the strength of its bare body, but even so, each thrash of its limbs created a strong burst of wind, pushing away the wind summoned by the spirit. Eugene's gaze traveled upwards towards the ceiling. Thin cracks had spread across it like a spider web from the previous battle. After calculating the location of its epicenter, Eugene cast a spell. Grun. The ceiling collapsed and countless metal fragments rained down on the Death Knight's head. They weren't just falling naturally either. Eugene's magic was infused into each and every one of the fragments, turning them into bullets that he could move as he wished. Bam bam bam. The bullets followed the Death Knight as it attempted to evade and pierced into its flesh regardless. Like this, Eugene was able to make the Death Knight move according to his will. If my body was just in better shape, I'd be able to take care of you with just my bare hands, Eugene boasted. It felt like a few of his bones were broken, and whenever he moved, there was throbbing pain coming from his internal organs. Eugene sighed in regret and struck the ground with his foot. Fush. Blue flames erupted from his feet and transformed into a hand that shot out at the Death Knight. Graw! The Death Knight roared and hastily spun around. The hand of flame barely glanced past its chest, tearing off a pauldron. Once again its armor had been broken. The Death Knight's eyes rolled around in anger. Frenzied rage stalled its ability to reason, and a monstrous fury was aroused. The Death Knight raised its hands into the air, forming giant claws. Eugene mocked it. That's why if you hold back you just turn to shit, asshole. The claws tore apart the blazing whirlwind. The Death Knight burst free and swung both arms at Eugene. But you were already shit anyway. Eugene flattened his body and dove beneath the Death Knight. The metal fragments stuck in its armor began to move according to Eugene's will. The Death Knight's body was frozen in mid-air. It was just for a moment, but that was enough to create an opening. In any case, with Eugene's remaining mana, it was impossible for him to completely control the Death Knight's movements. The slight stiffness in the Death Knight's movements bought Eugene more than enough time. Rays of moonlight flashed as the moonlight sword pierced the Death Knight's chest and accurately struck the reddish gem at its core. The Death Knight wasn't even able to make any final death throes. As the moonlight sword's blade of light dissipated, its body fell to the ground. In order to not get trapped beneath the corpse, Eugene quickly rolled out of the way. Uack. He then proceeded to dry heave. It had felt like he had kept a good control of the sword's strength, but his mana had already been far too low to start with. Eugene retched a few more times before getting up. Still, at least this is better, Eugene comforted himself. He was in a better state than he would have been if he had been forced to use ignition. Eugene gasped for breath and rubbed his lips clean. A glance at the moonlight sword revealed that it was no longer emitting any moonlight, so its blade was all but gone. This bullshit sword, Eugene muttered as he placed the moonlight sword back in its scabbard. Then he weakly staggered over to the Death Knight. Although it had lacked any sense of vitality from the very beginning, being only a deceased corpse, now it was fully dead. Eugene had felt its core breaking on the tip of his sword and he had seen it shatter as well. All that was left was the corpse of Hamel, and Eugene standing there blankly, staring down at his own corpse. This corpse proved that it had been no ordinary Death Knight. With a normal Death Knight, the moment that the core containing the soul was destroyed, the body would also disappear. However, this corpse had still been left lying in front of Eugene. This feels like shit, Eugene eventually muttered. Shouldn't there be limits on how far you could insult someone who had died? Not only had they dared to break into someone's grave, they had even turned his corpse into a death knight? Gritting his teeth, Eugene lifted WNYD upwards. For now, his priority was to destroy this thing and then escape with Layman, who was still lying down stunned on the other side of the door. The sword descended. Or at least it tried to. His arm wouldn't move. Eugene gritted his teeth. Drawing on the last of his strength and mana, he tried to pour strength into his arm, but it was completely immobile. It wasn't just his arm either. His whole body was being held against its will, unable to move. Fuck, Eugene snorted and spat out a curse. Being so tired that he was unable to move wasn't the cause of this. Rather, his entire body was being tied up by some great invisible force. Can't we talk this out face to face? Eugene requested. He wanted to turn his head to look around, but he wasn't able to do so. All that Eugene could do at this moment was move his lips and release his voice. And the fact that he was able to do so was because they had given him permission to open his mouth and speak. Visit. For the best no_understood experience. I'm thinking of what I should do with you. A voice approached him. Quite a lot of ideas spring to mind, but the one that most appeals to me is this. I will drag you up to the surface with me still tied up like this. Then I will throw you into some heated sand. Of course, I won't just let you die suffocated like that. I will make sure to leave holes for your eyes, nose, and mouth. You're too kind, Eugene said sarcastically. I'll make sure that your mouth is frozen open, unable to close. Your eyes will also be made unable to shut. Before long, your eyeballs will dry up and shatter into pieces, and your tongue will become like a withered twig. The voice was now coming from right behind Eugene's back. I think that I'll be baked dead in the sand before that even happens, Eugene pointed out. No, you won't. Because I won't allow that to happen. And after that. Do you know what a scarecrow is? The voice asked. Eugene answered, of course. You will become the scarecrow of this desert. I will break all the bones in your legs, wind them around each other and tie them tightly with your muscles and blood vessels so that they won't unravel. Then I'm going to drive long iron rods through each of these fingers of yours. The voice tapped one of Eugene's hands with a cold finger as it said this. From here, they will climb up your forearms and go across your shoulders until they reach the fingertips on the opposite side so that you'll be forced to keep your arms open wide. Though, you won't be able to see what happens to your body because your eyes will have already crumbled to dust. Well, even if you can't see it, you will certainly be able to feel it. I won't allow you to become so numb to pain that you block out these sensations. If you go that far, I'll probably already be dead from shock, Eugene pointed out. I told you that I won't let you die, the voice repeated. No matter what happens to your body, you will never die. That's how you will continue to serve me as this desert scarecrow. For a long, long time, until I finally become bored of you, I will make you stand in a place where I can see you, on your one twisted leg with your arms spread wide open. Ha! Do you know who I am? The touch traveled from his hand up to his arm and then caressed Eugene's neck. In stark contrast with their horrifying words, their fingers were soft and warm. You're Amelia Merwin, Eugene said, feeling disgust at her touch. It seems that you're well aware. I am Amelia Merwin, she confirmed. The dungeon master of the desert. The Black Thorn. The answer to death. That is me. Her hand stopped caressing his neck. Suppressing his boiling emotions, Eugene continued staring straight ahead. Amelia Merwin had brown skin and long dark hair that hung down her back. The expression on her face was unreadable, because her mouth was covered by a white veil. Although her purple eyes were fixed in a calm gaze, Eugene could feel a terrible murderous intent hidden deep within those pupils. You broke my pet, Amelia accused. Your pet? Eugene asked. Amelia pointed to the death knight at her feet. It may have been a useless pet, but it was mine. Whether it's to bully, destroy, or kill it, those are the sort of things that only its master gets to decide. You've really raised quite a disgusting pet. Shouldn't you at least regularly give it baths? The corpse stench was really. Eugene wasn't able to finish speaking. Pow! The staff that Amelia Merwin was holding smashed into Eugene's face. The only one who can say that sort of words about it is me, its owner, Amelia scolded. Eugene spat out the blood flowing from the cuts inside his mouth. Amelia's staff was made of various bones with the horned skull of a goat as the pommel. Fortunately, the horns were curved in the opposite direction, so he had just been smacked in the mouth. If he had been hit the wrong way, Eugene would now have sported a hole in his face. "Your pet almost bit me," Eugene said with a smile, revealing bloody teeth. "No, instead of biting, it actually tried to scratch me. If I had been less careful, I could have died." Amelia promised him, "You will regret not allowing yourself to die like that." "Balzac Ludbeth," Eugene said as he once again spat out the blood that kept flowing into his mouth. "You know who that is, right?" Instead of answering immediately, Amelia stared at Eugene. After a while she lightly shook her head. With each shake, a ringing sound came from the large gold earrings in her ear. "I really can't think of why you would bring up such a name at this time," Amelia said eventually. "It's not something I'm all that proud of, but I happen to be acquainted with Balzac. Did you know he actually wrote a letter for me and told me to give it to you if we met?" Amelia stayed silent as her eyes narrowed. Still staring at Eugene, she took a step back. Then the invisible bindings holding Eugene's body disappeared as well. Eugene collapsed on the spot and took a deep breath. "There will be consequences for saying such words," Amelia warned him. "I really don't like hearing his name." Eugene agreed. "I don't like saying that bastard's name either. Could he kill her?" Eugene considered this for a moment as he placed his hand inside of his cloak. The opponent was a wizard. No matter how fast she was at casting magic, there should still be a small opening. If he was able to take advantage of that opening, would he be able to kill her? Eugene immediately reached a conclusion. "I can't kill her." He wanted to try using ignition, but even if he did, it wouldn't work. She was different from the Death Knight. Amelia Merwin was a black wizard who was considered to be one of the strongest people in the entire world. For the current Eugene, even if he was given 100 chances, it would still be impossible to kill Amelia. Eugene set aside his regrets and pulled Balzac's letter out of his cloak. There was no need for him to hand it over personally. As soon as Eugene had taken out the letter left his hand and flew over to Amelia. "This seal," Amelia muttered as she stared at the wax seal sealing this envelope. "It's the real thing. I can't understand it. Who are you to that man that Balzac would write a letter for you?" "He said that he liked me," Eugene offered as an explanation. "Do you know what this letter means?" "He said that if I had this letter with me, you wouldn't kill me." "That's not exactly correct." Amelia continued speaking as she stared down at the envelope. "I received some help from Balzac at one point, a long time ago, and in return I promised to owe him a favor." Eugene listened silently. That favor should have been of great value to Balzac. Because with that he would be able to make one request of me, Amelia Merwin. For decades he hasn't asked me for anything, which means that he never had a problem which required him to use up this favor from me. Fush. Balzac's letter was engulfed in black flames and disappeared. "Do you know what I'm trying to say?" Amelia's eyes turned to look at Eugene once more. "Since he gave you this letter, it means that you can make a request of me on behalf of Balzac. Although it's up to me to see if I'm willing to listen to your request." "Well, that's quite something," Eugene said, unsure of what to say. "If you don't want to die, then ask me to spare you," Amelia advised. "If you do, then I won't kill you. However, I won't just let you go either. Why did you come here? How did you get here? And what did you do here? I need to hear the answers to these questions from you." "I want to commit suicide," Eugene lied. "I already told you that it's up to me whether or not to listen to your request." As she said this, her veil shook with laughter. Amelia tilted her head to the side as she continued speaking. "So I will give you two choices to choose from. If you choose not to speak, I will respect your choice. That means I will kill you. If you choose to live, I will spare you. But instead, I will hear everything from you that I want to know." These options left Eugene speechless. Amelia attempted to reassure him. "Don't worry too much. I won't play with my words by doing something like sparing you, but turning you into a cripple instead. As for torture, there's no need for that. Aside from torture, there are many other ways for me to get my answers from you. I really am very interested in you. How did you find your way into here when even the Sultan doesn't know about this place? The only ones who should have any knowledge of this location are the sand shamans. Was there a rat among them who was in communication with you? But that would be quite strange. They shouldn't have a reason for doing so. Damn it, Balzac. If he was going to write Eugene a letter like this, shouldn't Balzac at least have given him a proper explanation?" Although Eugene felt quite dissatisfied because of this, in fact, There was no need for Balzac to feel ashamed. How could Balzac have imagined that Eugene would truly invade Amelia Merwin's territory and destroy one of her possessions? What should I do? Eugene asked himself. Couldn't he make some other request? Apart from suicide, that is. What if I ask you not to pursue me? Eugene asked tentatively. Then I won't pursue you. But that request doesn't involve me sparing you, does it? Amelia pointed out. Even if Eugene could somehow get out of this situation, there were still a lot of problems. Amelia would do everything that she could to get those answers from Eugene, but Eugene absolutely didn't want to spill anything about it. She asked him why he came here. He could just say it by chance, of course, but Amelia would never believe him. In the first place, since she had said that she would get him to talk without resorting to torture, that meant she was going to use magic, and the mental manipulation spells that a black wizard like her could use were able to simply ignore their subject's will and draw out the right answers. It seems that your mind is racing. Whatever it is that you're thinking of, would you like me to listen to it and take it as your request? Amelia asked with a chuckle as she pointed her finger at Eugene. A dark light shone on the tip of her finger. Eugene was conscious of the moonlight sword whose hilt still hung at his waist. Using ignition, if he could first get off a swing with the moonlight sword and then run away. No, it was impossible. This space was already under Amelia's complete control. I will count to 3, Amelia whispered. 1. Could he use the name of the Lionheart clan? Would Amelia even respect the Lionhearts? Was the name even capable of dispelling the doubts of this bitch of a black wizard? 2. Should he just tell the truth? But what was he supposed to say? Eugene had entered the grave, opened the door that even Amelia had failed to open, and found the moonlight sword within. It all sounded like nonsense. If he said something like that, Amelia might spare Eugene, but she would definitely take the moonlight sword from him. There was an unexpected pause as Amelia didn't call out 3. With a surprised expression, she tilted her head and looked down. Her eyes were on Hamel's corpse, the remains of the Death Knight. Its eyes had opened and were now staring up at Amelia. Could this truly be? Amelia mumbled as she took a few steps backward. Eugene felt nauseous, as if his insides were being flipped over, and all the hairs on his body stood up as he felt terror wash over him. The Death Knight's 2 eyes, which had turned completely black, including the whites, turned to stare at Eugene. Eugene, no, Hamel knew this gaze. Why would he be here? Amelia mumbled in disbelief. She slowly got down onto one knee, but instead of bowing her head, she continued to stare at the Death Knight. The Death Knight slowly stood up. It's a demon king, Eugene thought as he swallowed the bile rising in the back of his throat. Chapter 70. After it stood up, the entity possessing the Death Knight didn't directly reveal who it was. However, there was an ominous presence lurking deep within those dark eyes. And just by the fact that Amelia had gotten down on one knee, Eugene could be sure that the presence within the Death Knight was none other than the Demon King of Incarceration himself. Eugene Lionheart, the Death Knight said. Although the words coming from its jaws were spoken in the same hoarse voice as before, they were packed with a power that made them feel incomparable to before. Eugene's heart, which was racing as if it was about to burst, cooled down instantly the moment he heard the undead's manner of speech. The cold sweat running down Eugene's back felt like a drop of ice. I have seen you through the eyes of Balzac Ludbeth, the Death Knight. No, the Demon King murmured. Are you here to offer flowers at the grave of your ancestor's closest companion? 1. Eugene didn't answer him. Since you have seen it, you should be aware of this as well. The owner of this grave is Hamel Dynas. 2. Although he is known to the world as Stupid Hamel, he was truly far from stupid. Among dear Vermouth's comrades, he was especially outstanding and strong, so much so that Vermouth always kept that man by his side. What makes you think that you have the right to talk like that? Eugene barely managed to suppress this shout as it threatened to burst out of his mouth. He bit his lips with such force that they were bruised and split, dripping blood down his chin. Eugene glared at the Demon King with bloodshot eyes. I do not comprehend your hostility, the Demon King commented. Even though Eugene was blatantly emitting killing intent, the Demon King didn't show any signs of displeasure. Vermouth and I truly understood each other and built a friendship based on this understanding, the Demon King claimed. Admittedly, trying to force such a relationship from 300 years ago onto his distant descendants would be a ridiculous stretch. I might respect the Lionhearts as the descendants of a close confidant, But that does not give me reason to force you to return this respect. Eugene kept a firm hold of his tongue. This may be our first time meeting in person, Eugene Lionheart, but I'm already aware of your exceptional accomplishments. It has been 300 years since Vermouth passed away. I have seen many Lionhearts during this time, but among those, I believe that you are the one who has most strongly inherited the blood of Vermouth. Ha! Eugene could help but bark out a laugh of incredulity. Dear Vermouth? Respect? All of what the Demon King had been talking about had already seemed absurd, but what he was saying now felt even more ridiculous. Lionheart. I see, so that's how things are, Amelia, who was still kneeling on one knee, muttered to herself. Gray hair and golden eyes. The Keel Empire's Lionheart clan. Amelia stared at the Demon King through narrowed eyes and asked, for you to personally come to this shabby place, using this Death Knight as your vessel. Demon King of Incarceration, how am I supposed to accept such an honor? The Demon King dismissed her veiled barb. It is your freedom to choose how you respond to my presence. However, I still need to accept the consequences that come with this freedom, right? Please don't speak to me in such an impish manner. Demon King of Incarceration, is your purpose for coming here really just to protect this naughty lion? Amelia demanded. It is because he is the descendant of my close confidant. As the Demon King said this, he turned his gaze towards her. Amelia's eyes shook slightly as they met with those pitch-black eyes. She covered her veil, which was shaking from her rapid breaths, with her hands. Once she had composed herself, she asked, just for that, are you really going to suppress my freedom which you've always claimed to respect? Amelia Merwin, the Demon King intoned. Although I may love and respect you, I don't love and respect you as much as I do Vermouth. Vermouth is dead. However, his bloodline has continued uninterrupted, especially within Eugene Lionheart. In him I can see the appearance of my old friend Vermouth. These words stirred up Eugene's emotions even more. Eugene wondered what kind of reaction this Demon King would show if he got up right now and started cursing this bitch of a Demon King to his face. Didn't he say that he wouldn't force the Lionhearts to return his respect? If that was the case, wouldn't it be alright even if Eugene did swear at him? The ghost of someone who died 300 years ago, you're saying that you respect it more than me who's currently living? Amelia angrily demanded, her emotions having been similarly agitated by the Demon King's words. Amelia's eyes widened and she tried to stand up, but things didn't move according to her will. Her body was about to get up only to sink back down again. Amelia showed a flustered expression on her face, but she didn't release any sounds of distress. Instead she glared at the Demon King with even more venom in her eyes. She hissed, you dared to my body. You have indeed been given independence, but that independence can never supersede my authority, the Demon King said. Amelia Merwin. No matter what you planned to do with Hamel's grave, I respected your freedom to do so. But if you wish to harm Vermouth's descendants, then I am afraid I cannot allow that. At least not for now. For now. Eugene hadn't missed those last words. He raised both eyes and glared up at the Demon King. What do you mean by that? He demanded. As I thought, you really are a disrespectful brat, Amelia spat out with frowning eyes. She felt infuriated that Eugene wasn't showing proper respect to the Demon King. Vermouth is dead, the Demon King said. Although to me it doesn't feel like it happened too long ago. It has already been 300 years. That's quite a long time for humans at least. During these past 300 years, I feel like I have continued to show a sufficient amount of goodwill and respect to Vermouth's descendants. Amelia no longer showed any signs of displeasure, and instead stared at the Demon King with eyes full of anticipation. The Demon King's voice lowered as he continued speaking. I have respected their freedom to not show me any goodwill or respect in return. However, I am concerned that you may be taking my continued goodwill for granted. First and foremost, I am the ruler of numerous demonic beasts and demon folk, a king of Helmuth. With each word that the Demon King said, Eugene felt like his heart was being constricted in a vice. While enduring this pressure that felt like someone was stepping on his chest, Eugene glared at the Demon King. Eugene refused to kneel in front of the Demon King. He had no reason to kneel, nor did he wish to. The Demon King lectured, with freedom comes responsibility. Freedom without responsibility is just indulgence. Descendant of Vermouth, tell this to everyone in the Lionheart clan. Do not take the goodwill that I have granted you as an incentive to go too far. If you will not give me my due regard, then I shall no longer respect you either. Eugene clearly understood the meaning of these words. It was a warning. The demon king of incarceration hadn't attempted to conquer the world in the past hundreds of years, and had instead taken to showing his goodwill and respect to the other countries. Yuad's affair, which had taken place just 2 years ago, was one such example. To the demon king of incarceration, Yuad's scandal wasn't significant enough to even be considered a problem. That said, the demon king of incarceration had still gone out of his way to solve the situation peacefully. Balzac Ludbeth, who was personally contracted to the demon king, had bowed his head to the Lionheart clan's patriarch, and the demon king had even beheaded the incubus who had attempted to contract Yuad. It wasn't just the Lionheart clan. Following the oath made 300 years ago, there had still been a lot of people who were wary of Helmuth's demon folk and demon kings. The Holy Empire and the Anti-Demon Alliance, who were located in Helmuth's immediate vicinity, had made several attempts to rally support for conquering Helmuth and slaying the remaining demon kings. Of course, an attempt had never actually taken place, but there had been several musterings of armed forces. Even now, the troops of the Holy Empire were stationed on the border with Helmuth, and the forces of the Anti-Demon Alliance were aligned with them. However, both Helmuth and the Demon King of Incarceration had simply ignored them. For the past 300 years, the demon folk had worked hard to rectify their image, but in spite of that, there were still places on the continent where demon folk were being oppressed. In Eugene's opinion, they were just receiving the punishment that they deserved. He knew full well just how terrible the world had been 300 years ago. However, the demon folk of Helmuth certainly wouldn't think so. And perhaps that went for the demon king of incarceration as well. What are your reasons for coming here and saying these words now? Eugene managed to spit out after taking a deep breath. After having been silent for 300 years, what was it that made him send a warning now of all times? Your ancestor may have made an oath in exchange for his freedom, but now the end of that promise is drawing near, the demon king revealed. The time is coming for the wheel that has stalled to resume moving forward once more. Eugene silently processed these words. The demon king paused and thought for a brief moment. Someday, we may have to make a new oath. I wonder who will be able to make a new promise in Vermouth's stead, and stop this wheel once more. Just what the hell was in the oath? Eugene burst out once more. The demon king did not respond for a few moments. Then Hamel's lips twitched in a faint smile as he said, "You do not deserve to know such details." Eugene struggled to keep himself from cursing. "Because you are not Vermouth," the demon king explained. "My ancestor died 300 years ago," Eugene reluctantly argued. "It seems that you resent your ancestor," the demon king observed. Eugene was struck dumb. The demon king smirked. "You stupid lion." Those words. Eugene's body trembled in surprise. He unconsciously tried to run towards the demon king, but his body wouldn't move according to his will. The demon king stared at Eugene's trembling body and continued speaking, "Your existence, your soul, and everything else that you have. It's all thanks to Vermouth's oath that you were able to be born now, after 300 years have passed." "What?" Eugene grunted in confusion. "Amelia Merwin," the demon king said, no longer looking at Eugene. Eugene desperately tried to squeeze out a few words, but his voice just wouldn't come out. The same force that had been constricting his heart was now constricting his throat. "Return to your dungeon," the demon king ordered. "I still have something that I need to ask that brat about," Amelia tried to argue. "There is nothing that he can tell you." "But that's absurd. My pet is dead because of him. And then there's that door." "There is nothing beyond that door." As the demon king said this, he reached his hand out towards the door. At this gesture, the closed door turned to dust and disappeared. On the other side, Layman was still collapsed on the floor, having yet to come to his senses. This sight caused a bewildered expression to appear on Amelia's face. "Nothing of importance happened here," the demon king affirmed once more. Amelia desperately wanted to refute this. Nonetheless, in the face of the demon king's gaze as he stared right at her, she couldn't put up any resistance. She eventually squeezed out a question. "Demon king of incarceration. Have you developed a fondness for that body?" "I will return this corpse to you," the demon king reassured her. "Is that all right? Isn't that the body belonging to your dear cherished Vermouth's friend?" "I have no fondness for Hamel." This reply caused Amelia to burst into laughter. Straightening up from her bent knee, she nodded her head. Then she looked at Eugene and said, You got lucky. Eugene glared at her silently. The next time your luck won't be as good as it was today, Amelia threatened. She was still left with a lot of questions about this place. Just in case, Amelia had tried to read the memories recorded in the mana. But it was just as the Demon King of Incarceration had said. The mana's memory had been erased, making it appear like nothing had happened here. It wouldn't be too much trouble for the Demon King of Incarceration to have done something like this, but it felt unlikely that the Demon King would go so far to protect that young lion. Next time, Amelia promised herself as she slowly turned away. The Demon King of Incarceration had made his will clear. Amelia also didn't know anything about the contents of the oath, but she was more interested in the warning that the Demon King of Incarceration had given, that the oath was about to expire, than in what the oath involved. She couldn't do anything about this brat right now, but someday, once the oath was over with, there would come a time when things wouldn't stop at just a warning. Amelia Merwin left the grave. The Demon King of Incarceration, who had possessed the Death Knight for this brief period of time, also left with her. Nevertheless, Eugene remained fixed on the spot for quite some time. Until the very end, he had refused to kneel to the Demon King of Incarceration. Even now he remained standing. The Demon King of Incarceration may have already disappeared, but Eugene was forcing himself to stay upright. He didn't want to collapse, nor did he want to just sit down. Eugene stood there for quite a while trying to get control over his emotions. In the end he couldn't stand it any longer and screamed, "Arg!" Eugene stomped on the ground several times, then he smashed his fists against the cracked walls. He didn't care about his exhausted body, his injuries, or anything else. Roaring out several curses, Eugene vented his anger. That fucking bastard. After his tantrum had continued for quite some time, Eugene's rage had settled slightly. He took deep breaths and sat down on the ground. He knows about me, Eugene thought to himself. Stupid lion. That choice of words had to be deliberate. My existence, my soul, and everything else is only possible because of Vermouth's oath? What does that even mean? Could it be? Had the Demon King of Incarceration meant to say that Vermouth had sworn an oath with the Demon Kings in exchange for Hamel's reincarnation? But this sounded absurd. Perhaps there were some pure feelings of friendship hidden deep within that dreary man's chest, that made it so that Vermouth couldn't get over the death of his comrade. But if that guy had truly cared for Hamel, then he would have just prioritized killing the Demon Kings instead of arranging for Hamel's reincarnation. Visit for the best no_understood experience. In the first place, that oath was something along the lines of a peace treaty. It shouldn't have been focused on my reincarnation. Didn't the Demon King of Incarceration say something else as well? That in exchange for the oath, Vermouth had sacrificed his freedom. The end of the oath, the stopped wheel. That motherfucking incarceration bastard. As a Demon King, why does he have to be so coy with his words? The more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was about to boil over. Should he have just let loose at the Demon King without thinking about the consequences? There were hundreds of curses that Eugene had wanted to fling at him, so he should have just gone ahead and tossed them all at the Demon King. I have no fondness for Hamel. I also hate you, you son of a bitch, Eugene cursed as he ground his teeth. In the end he hadn't managed to destroy the corpse from his previous life that had been turned into a Death Knight. All right. It couldn't be helped. Rather than the deceased body from his previous life, wasn't the body that he had been reincarnated into more important? I got lucky? That goes for you too. Because next time I'm going to kill you, Eugene promised Amelia in his head. The Demon King of Incarceration hadn't killed Eugene. Even though he knew that Eugene was Hamel, the Demon King still hadn't killed him. He hadn't asked what had happened beyond that door either. I wonder who will be able to make a new promise in Vermouth's stead, and stop this will once more. I have no intention of making any promises. As he thought this, Eugene reached into his cloak. Why should I try and stop that wheel? If that fucking thing starts moving again rather than stop it, I just need to break it. If his reincarnation had been arranged by Vermouth instead of Sienna or Anise, then you won't be expecting too much from me, right? Eugene pulled his hand out of his cloak. What he had pulled out were a few withered leaves. He had found these leaves in the room where the Moonlight Sword had been sealed. Why were there leaves fallen here, deep underground, where there weren't even weeds, let alone trees? A nasty thought comes to mind, Eugene mumbled as he stood up. 200 years ago, after Vermouth had died, somebody had intruded into this grave. Sienna had noticed what was going on in the grave, so she had traveled all the way here from Akron. She had gotten into a fight with the intruder and then she had disappeared. Eugene recognized these leaves. These are the leaves of the world tree. They were a treasure that Sienna valued even more than the leaves of the world tree, the holy figure of the elves' religion. With these, it was possible to teleport to the forest of the elves from anywhere in the world. If Sienna had been driven into a corner, she may have used the leaves of the world tree to warp to the forest of the elves. But who was the one who had broken into his grave? Had they really been able to back Sienna into a corner? He was also reminded of a previous mystery. A lich's curse is said to annihilate both body and soul. Eugene stumbled as he tried to stand up. Was it cured by Anise? Or perhaps it was due to the power of the holy sword. In any case, it seems that I wasn't annihilated by any standard. His corpse and his soul had been preserved. Then they had both been placed in this grave. Then someone took my body from the coffin in that room, and brought it out here. But the only one who could do that would be Vermouth. So he faked his death. But what reason could he have had for doing that? Eugene suspected that the one who had fought with Sienna was Vermouth himself. But he truly didn't want to believe this.